A plane lost its roof at 24,000 feet. This is what happened next. Aboard Flight 243 on that fateful day, were 89 passengers and 6 crew members, including Captain Robert Skornstheimer and First Officer Madeline Tompkins. Together, they had more than 10,000 hours of flight experience with this model of aircraft, the Boeing 737. The plane was 19 years old, about 10 years from the end of its expected lifespan. And earlier that day, it had made 3 round-trip flights from Honolulu to Hilo, Maui, and Kauai. Nothing unusual is noted in the pre-departure inspection. And the plane had recently passed a Boeing service bulletin and an airworthiness directive by 2 separate inspectors. On paper, the aircraft was in top condition and ready to go. However, as one passenger was getting on, she looked out over the boarding bridge and noticed a crack in the aircraft's fuselage about halfway between the aircraft door and the bridge hood. She assumed the staff must have known about it, and so said nothing to any ground crew or personnel. After all, pre-flight checks were cleared, the plane took off without incident. The aircraft began its ascent, climbing up further and further with passengers still being shown the seatbelt on signs. As the pilots started leveling off the plane at around 24,000 feet, that's when they heard it. A boom. A huge cacophonous eruption followed by the rushing sound of wind. First Officer Tompkins' head was flung back and she saw pieces of debris like insulation foam floating around in the cockpit. It was then that the pilots looked back and noticed the entry door to the cockpit was missing. But where the first-class ceiling should have been, all they could see now was blue sky. Out in first class, passengers were clinging to their seats, utterly terrified. They'd witnessed a small section of the left-hand side of the plane suddenly rupture, which had led to explosive decompression of the cabin and 300-mile-per-hour winds ripping off the roof. Now aircraft have cabin air systems that control pressurization, airflow, and temperature. The higher up in the atmosphere a plane flies, the less oxygen there is and the colder it gets. So, these systems are critical to ensure passengers don't suffocate or freeze on their flight. When combustible decompression happens, these systems stop working, which is why on passenger planes, oxygen masks drop from the ceiling. However, on Flight 243, an 18-foot section of the roof and sides of the plane had been torn off above the passenger's head along with their oxygen masks. They were, thankfully, still strapped into their seats, but the cabin crew that had been standing there had to cling on to anything they could to prevent being swept off their feet, but tragically one didn't make it in time. Number 1, Attendant Clarabelle Lansing, was immediately swept out of the hole that appeared in the left side of the aircraft. Number 2, Attendant Michelle Honda, was thrown to the ground, but managed to crawl up and down the aisle to check on the passengers and try to keep them calm. With the cockpit still mostly intact, the pilots donned their own oxygen masks. They realized quickly that all of their controls felt loose. The plane was rolling left and right, threatening to drop out of the sky any second. Tompkins turned their transponder into an emergency code to notify Honolulu that they needed to make an emergency landing in nearby Maui. But the noise of the cockpit was so loud none of her transmissions could be heard. The pilots couldn't communicate with the flight attendants or even hear one another. And so, resorting to hand signals, they began an emergency descent. Wasting no time, they dropped fast, at one point plummeting down at more than 4,100 feet per minute. Eventually they dropped below 14,000 feet. Tompkins was able to reach Maui's emergency channel and requested an emergency landing, along with medical equipment for what she assumed would be a lot of casualties and fatalities. As the passengers in first class began to suffocate from the lack of oxygen. When they made it below 10,000 feet, Captain Skornstheimer slowed the aircraft down in accordance with air traffic control speed limitations. At this height, they could at least breathe and began to gradually turn the plane towards the runway. As he slowed down to 170 knots, about 195 miles per hour, he noticed the plane became less responsive. To land, He needed to be going at least 130 knots, around 50 miles per hour slower, but he had no choice. It was either slow down and lose control of the plane in the air, or make it to the runway and risk crashing in a super speedy landing. He ordered Tompkins to lower the landing gear. The main gear light flashed green, but one extension light wasn't green, the nose gear wasn't down. They manually overrode the computer to drop it, but the light refused to illuminate. They tried it one more time and pulled the override handle down, but the light still wasn't on. And instead of wasting time trying to clear it, the captain insisted on landing the plane immediately. If he was wrong and the front landing gear wasn't actually down, they weren't going to hit the tarmac at almost 200 miles per hour, without anything to stabilize the front of the plane. It'd be a guaranteed crash, but they had no choice but to pray. Thankfully, those landing gear indicator lights turned out to be malfunctioning. The nose gear was indeed down, and 13 minutes after the combustible decompression, Schornstheimer and Tompkins hit the runway and successfully landed. What greeted the emergency services at Kahului Airport made everyone's jaws drop. The plane had been ripped open like a can of sardines. Of the 89 passengers and crew, 65 of them were injured, 8 seriously, and 1, Clarabelle Lansing, fatally. The plane too was damaged beyond repair. Sadly, Clarabelle Lansing's body was never found, but it could have been worse were it not for the incredibly brave actions of the crew. They were rightfully hailed as heroes.